Hey guys, tonight we step into a place where the air itself feels like it's watching you, where every breath stings just enough to remind you that comfort is a luxury you left behind miles ago. You're standing at the edge of Alaska's endless wilderness, boots sinking into snow that hasn't known footprints in weeks, maybe months. It's quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that hums in your ears like something waiting. And here's the thing. You probably won't survive this. Not because you're weak, but because this place doesn't care if you're strong.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time down in the comments. I like knowing where in the world you're listening from while we freeze together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive with more confidence than sense, which, to be fair, is how most stories like this begin. The year is somewhere in the mid-20th century, a time when Alaska is still raw, not yet softened by highways or reliable supply lines. That's your first historical reality check. Even by the 1950s, vast parts of Alaska remained completely unmapped in detail, with only scattered trappers and indigenous communities truly understanding the land. And now, there's you. Your first step off whatever brought you here, boat, sled, maybe a questionable bush plane, is heavier than expected. Snow doesn't just crunch here, it swallows. Each movement feels like you're being gently pulled downward, as if the ground itself is testing your resolve. You tell yourself it's fine. It's just cold. People handle cold all the time.
Then the wind arrives. It doesn't howl dramatically like in movies. That would almost be comforting. Instead, it slices. Sharp, invisible, efficient. You feel it slip through the seams of your clothing, like it's been doing this longer than you've been alive. Which it has. Historians still argue whether early lone settlers underestimated the Alaskan winter more because of poor information or overconfidence. Standing here now, you can confirm it's probably both. You set down your pack and take a slow look around. Endless white, broken only by dark lines of spruce trees standing like quiet observers. Those trees will matter later, though you don't know it yet. Right now, they just look like they're judging you. Here's a quirky detail you definitely didn't expect. In extreme cold, metal can stick to your skin almost instantly. So when your bare fingers brush against a tool for just a second too long, you learn very quickly, painfully, that Alaska doesn't do gentle reminders. It does consequences. Immediate ones.
You try to get organized. Firewood, shelter, something resembling a plan. But your hands aren't listening anymore. They're stiff, slow, like they belong to someone else. Your breath clouds in front of you, thick and constant, a reminder that warmth is escaping your body with every exhale. And still, it's quiet. That silence presses in, not empty, but full, like the land is holding its breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. You laugh once under your breath, just to break it, just to prove you can. It sounds small out here. You're alone now, completely. And the first winter hasn't even really started yet. The first thing you learn, after the cold, after the silence, after that brief moment of realizing you've made a spectacularly questionable life decision, is that the land is always talking. Not loudly, not kindly, but constantly. You just weren't listening before. Now you have to. You start with the snow beneath your boots. It isn't just snow anymore. It's texture, weight, memory. Some patches crunch sharply, brittle and fresh. Others sink softly, hiding layers of older storms compressed into quiet history. You kneel,
brushing aside the top layer with stiff fingers, noticing how the color shifts ever so slightly. That faint blue tint? Older, denser snow. Colder, too. Everything here has a personality, and none of it is interested in introductions. A mainstream fact slips into your awareness as you piece things together. Experienced Arctic travelers have long relied on snow conditions to predict weather. Indigenous communities across Alaska could read these subtle changes the way you'd read a text message, quick, instinctive, and usually correct. Meanwhile, you're out here squinting at snow like it just insulted you personally. You move forward, slower now, observing, listening. The forest edge looms closer, dark spruce trees rising like a wall. And suddenly, there, marks in the snow. Tracks. At first, they're just dense, random impressions that your brain tries to dismiss as coincidence. But then you crouch lower, following the pattern. Paired shapes, evenly spaced. Something walked here, recently. You trace the line with your eyes, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and immediate regret. Because if you can see it, it can probably see you. You straighten up quickly, trying to look less like prey and more like, well, something that isn't prey. It's not convincing. Even you don't buy it. Here's a strange little tidbit. Snow can preserve tracks with such clarity that hunters have been known to follow animals hours or even days after they pass through. It's like the wilderness leaves receipts. Unfortunately, you're currently the least qualified detective on the case. Still, you follow them. Not far, just enough to understand direction, weight, maybe size. The impressions are deeper than you expected. Heavier animal. 4 legs, most likely. You decide, very wisely, that you don't need to meet it today. Or ever, if we're being honest. You pivot away, heart beating a little faster now, senses sharper. Everything matters here. Every broken twig, every shift in wind. Speaking of wind, you feel it change before you fully notice it. A subtle shift, colder somehow, carrying a different scent. Not that you can smell much through the sting in your nose, but there's something cleaner, sharper. Weather is moving. Historians still argue whether early wilderness survival depended more on physical endurance or environmental awareness. Out here, you're starting to suspect awareness wins. Strength doesn't help much if you walk straight into a storm you didn't see coming. You look up. The sky is pale, almost flat, but the clouds, if you can call them that, are thickening, spreading. It's not dramatic. No thunder, no warning sirens, just a slow closing in, like a door you didn't realize was open. You pick up your pace. Not rushing. Rushing wastes energy, but with purpose now. The trees ahead aren't just scenery anymore. They're shelter, windbreak, maybe even fuel. As you step into the forest line, everything changes again. The wind softens, filtered through branches heavy with snow. The ground feels different underfoot, less exposed, more uneven. Needles crunch beneath the snow layer, releasing a faint, sharp scent. Spruce. You don't know it yet, but those trees are going to matter more than almost anything else out here. Not just for warmth, not just for shelter. Something else. Something small but strangely vital. For now, though, you keep moving between them, eyes scanning, brain working harder than it has in a long time. You're learning. Slowly, clumsily, but learning. And in this place, that might be the only thing keeping you alive. Because the land isn't trying to help you, but it is leaving clues. And if you miss them, well, let's just say Alaska doesn't do second chances very often. You pause for a moment, leaning against the rough bark of a spruce tree, catching your breath. It smells faintly resinous, almost comforting in a strange way. Like the forest is whispering, not welcoming, but acknowledging. You made it this far. Now figure out the rest.
The forest doesn't welcome you, but it does something almost as useful. It slows things down just enough for you to make mistakes without immediately paying for them. That's important because your next lesson is going to be built entirely out of mistakes. You decide it's time to build a shelter. Not tomorrow, not after you scout a bit more. Now. Because even though the sky hasn't fully committed to a storm yet, you can feel it hovering in the background, like a bad idea waiting for the right moment. Your first attempt is ambitious, which is a polite way of saying deeply flawed. You gather branches, mostly deadfall, stacking them into something that resembles a lean-to. You've seen drawings before. Simple structures angled against a support designed to block wind. Easy. Straightforward. Almost relaxing, in theory. You try again. This time you choose a better spot, tucked between thicker spruce trunks, where the wind naturally breaks. Already an improvement. You angle the main support more carefully, testing its stability before adding weight. The branches go on tighter, layered like overlapping scales. You pack snow along the sides, not just as filler, but as insulation. Snow, you're realizing, isn't just the enemy, it's also material. Historians still argue whether the greatest survival advantage came from tools or knowledge passed through generations. Right now, you'd trade most of your gear for about 10 minutes of proper instruction from someone who actually knows what they're doing. Still, the structure begins to take shape. Not perfect, not pretty, but it stands. And more importantly, it blocks the wind. You crawl inside, shifting awkwardly to test the space. It's cramped, uneven, and smells faintly of damp wood and cold air. But compared to outside, it feels like a luxury suite. Low bar, but you'll take it. Here's a quirky detail you wouldn't expect. In extreme cold, a poorly ventilated shelter can become dangerous not from freezing, but from trapped moisture and carbon dioxide if you eventually add fire. In other words, even your safe space can quietly turn on you. Alaska loves a plot twist. You lie there for a moment, listening. The forest creaks softly around you, branches adjusting under the weight of snow. The wind brushes past, muted now, like it's lost interest, at least temporarily. Then, a soft drift of powder sifts down through a gap you didn't notice, right onto your face. You blink. Of course. You patch it, adjusting the angle, reinforcing weak spots. Every movement is slower now, more deliberate. You're not just building, you're learning through failure, refining each small decision. Time stretches strangely here. Minutes feel longer, but somehow less productive. By the time you finish reinforcing the structure, the light has shifted again. Not dramatically, just enough to remind you that daylight is limited, and you've spent a good portion of it wrestling with sticks. You step outside briefly, scanning the area. The sky is heavier now, clouds thickening into something more serious. The air feels tighter, like it's holding back a deeper cold. Storm's coming. No debate about it anymore. You duck back inside, pulling your pack closer, arranging what little you have. This is where you'll ride it out, your imperfect, hard-earned shelter. You settle in, adjusting your position, trying to ignore the subtle drafts that still sneak through. It's not comfortable, but it's survivable. And out here, that's the only category that matters. You exhale slowly, watching the faint cloud of your breath linger in the dim space. Not perfect, but it's yours. And tonight, that might be enough. Hunger doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't kick the door down and announce itself like a villain. It seeps in, quiet, persistent, annoyingly patient. At first, it's just a background thought, something you notice between tasks. Then it lingers longer, Then it starts making decisions for you. By the time you admit you need food, actual, reliable food, you're already behind. You step out from your shelter with that hollow feeling sitting low in your stomach, a kind of internal echo. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a fresh, untouched layer of snow. Beautiful, in a completely unhelpful way. Every track you studied yesterday? Gone. Reset. Alaska just hit the refresh button on your survival progress. You stand there for a moment, taking it in, and then you sigh. Not dramatically, just resigned. All right, start again. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind as you scan the area. Many early Alaskan trappers relied heavily on smell game. Hares, ptarmigan, even squirrels, because large game required tools, time, and experience they didn't always have. You, currently, have none of those things in useful quantities. So, congratulations. You're aiming for the woodland equivalent of whatever you can get. You begin by looking for movement, not chasing, just observing. The forest feels different after a storm, quieter somehow, as if everything is recalibrating. Then, near a cluster of low branches, you spot it. Faint disturbances in the snow. Not as clear as before, but enough. Small tracks this time. Light. Quick. You crouch, studying them like you've suddenly become an expert, which you absolutely have not. Still, they zigzag slightly, disappearing under a bush, reappearing on the other side. Something nervous. Something edible. You follow. Slowly. Carefully. And immediately realize how bad you are at this. Your boots crunch too loudly. Your balance shifts awkwardly. At one point, you step on a buried branch that snaps with the kind of sound that probably echoes across 3 zip codes. Somewhere out there, whatever made those tracks is now very aware that you exist, and has wisely chosen not to participate further. You stop, exhale, and rub your face. Hunting, it turns out, is less about enthusiasm and more about patience. A lot more patience. Historians still argue whether survival hunting is primarily a physical skill or a mental discipline. Right now, with your stomach reminding you of every poor step, you're leaning heavily toward mental. Because physically, you're just wandering around scaring lunch away.
You try a different approach. Less chasing, more waiting. You find a spot near where the tracks were densest, settle yourself as quietly as possible, and sit. And sit. And sit some more. Time stretches again, but differently now. Slower, heavier. Your legs start to stiffen, your hands ache from the cold, and your mind begins offering helpful suggestions like maybe just go back and eat something imaginary? You ignore it. Barely. Here's a strange, almost comforting tidbit. In extreme conditions, the body can start dulling hunger signals temporarily, almost like a built-in coping mechanism. It doesn't mean you're fine. It just means your body is trying to buy time, which is both helpful and mildly concerning. Eventually, there's movement. Subtle. A flicker near the base of a tree. You freeze. A small animal, quick, grayish, alert, edges into view. It pauses, sniffing the air, completely unaware that you've just become the most focused version of yourself imaginable. Every muscle tightens, every breath slows. This is it. You shift slightly, just enough to prepare, and immediately ruin everything. The animal bolts, gone in a blur of motion so fast it almost feels imaginary. You sit there, staring at the empty space where it was.
your expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet frustration. Well, that could have gone better. You let out a slow breath, leaning back against the tree behind you. No food. Not yet. But something did change. You saw it. You were close. Closer than before. That matters. You stand, stretching stiff limbs, and glance back toward your shelter. The forest doesn't feel quite as unreadable now. Still difficult. Still indifferent. But not completely impossible. You'll try again. Smarter next time. Quieter. Because hunger isn't going anywhere. And eventually, neither are you. You don't find food that day, or the next, not in any meaningful way. A few hopeful attempts, a couple of near misses, one deeply unimpressive moment where you seriously consider whether chewing on pine needles counts as a strategy. It doesn't. Your teeth would like a word. Hunger changes you faster than the cold ever could. The cold is external. You fight it, layer against it, outlast it. Hunger, though, it moves in. It rearranges your thoughts, shortens your patience, sharpens your focus into something almost uncomfortable. You stop thinking about long-term plans. Everything becomes immediate, simple. Eat, or figure out how to eat. And that's when the trees stop looking like scenery. You notice it while standing near one of the spruces, the same kind you leaned against earlier. Remember that faint resin smell? This time, it's stronger. Not because the tree changed, but because your attention did. You brush your hand along the needles, then bring your fingers closer, hesitating for just a second before inhaling. Sharp, clean, almost citrusy, in a way that feels completely out of place in this frozen world. There's something here. A mainstream historical fact quietly surfaces. For centuries, indigenous peoples in Alaska and northern regions used spruce needles to make tea rich in vitamin C, helping prevent scurvy during long winters when fresh food was scarce. You pause, processing that. Vitamin C. Health. Survival. From a tree you almost ignored. You glance around, half expecting the forest to nod approvingly. It doesn't. Still judging. Fair enough. You gather a small handful of fresh green needles, careful not to take too much from one branch. There's a strange sense of respect in the motion now, like you're not just grabbing resources, but borrowing something. You head back to your shelter, already thinking through the process. Water, heat, timing. Simple. Probably. Hopefully. Inside, you set things up with a focus that feels almost ceremonial. Melted snow becomes your water source. Slow, inefficient, but reliable. You add the needles once it's hot enough, watching them darken slightly, releasing that scent again, stronger now. The space fills with it, cutting through the cold air like a quiet rebellion. Here's a quirky detail you wouldn't expect. Spruce tea doesn't taste like what most people imagine. It's not overly bitter or harsh. It's surprisingly mild, almost refreshing, with a subtle tang that wakes you up more than any modern energy drink probably should. Nature's version of, hey, stay alive, apparently. You take a cautious sip. Warmth spreads first, then flavor. Light, clean, faintly resinous, but not unpleasant. Your body reacts before your brain fully catches up, leaning into the heat, into the simple act of consuming something that isn't just empty. It's not food, not really, but it's something. And right now, something is everything. Historians still argue whether small comforts like this, rituals, warm drinks, familiar actions, play a larger role in survival than we tend to admit. Sitting here now, hands wrapped around that makeshift cup, you'd argue they might be essential, not just for the body, but for the mind. Because this feels like control. You take another sip, slower this time, letting the moment stretch. Outside, the wind brushes past your shelter again, softer now, almost distant. Inside, the faint steam curls upward, carrying that sharp green scent with it. You realize something quietly, almost without thinking. You're not just surviving the wilderness anymore. You're starting to understand it. Not fully, not even close, but enough to work with it instead of constantly against it. The trees aren't just obstacles, they're shelter, fuel, and now a kind of lifeline. You lean back slightly, exhaling as the warmth settles deeper into you. The hunger hasn't disappeared. It's still there, still waiting, but it's quieter for the moment, managed. And in a place like this, managing is a victory. A small one, sure, but out here, small victories stack up into something much bigger. You glance toward the entrance of your shelter, where a thin line of pale light filters through. The forest beyond is still vast, still indifferent, still full of challenges you haven't even imagined yet. But now, you have something to carry forward. Not just the tea, the understanding that even in the coldest, quietest places, there are things waiting to help you, if you learn how to see them. You take one last sip, letting the warmth linger a little longer this time. Not bad. Honestly, not bad at all. The warmth from the spruce tea doesn't last forever, but the idea of it does. That's the shift. Not just the heat in your hands, but the realization that the land isn't a locked door. It's more like a puzzle with very high stakes and zero instructions. And now, finally, you've solved one tiny piece. You start noticing patterns you would have missed before. The way the trees cluster tighter in certain areas, almost like they're huddling against the wind. The slight dips in the land where snow gathers deeper, hiding uneven ground beneath. And more importantly, the roots, the natural paths between things. At first, you just wander them. Then you begin to remember them. That fallen log shaped like a bent arm, the split spruce with one half leaning awkwardly away, a patch where the snow always seems thinner, revealing dark soil beneath. You don't have a map, not in any physical sense, but something starts forming in your mind. A layout, loose at first, then slowly tightening into something reliable. A mainstream historical fact fits quietly into this realization. Long before modern maps, trappers and indigenous travelers in Alaska navigated using mental mapping, memorizing landmarks and seasonal changes rather than relying on drawn charts. Paper, after all, doesn't hold up well in a blizzard. Neither does overconfidence, as you've already discovered. You begin marking things, subtly. Not big, obvious signs. That would be too easy to lose or bury, but small adjustments. A branch angled a certain way, a notch cut into bark. Just enough that when you pass through again, something clicks. Familiar. Here's a quirky detail. In some survival traditions, people intentionally create memory triggers in the landscape, tiny, almost invisible changes that only they would recognize. It's like leaving yourself breadcrumbs, except the forest isn't actively trying to eat them. Usually. You move farther now, cautiously extending your range. Each trip out is a little longer, a little more confident. And each time you return to your shelter, not by luck, but by choice. That matters more than you expected.
Historians still argue whether long-term isolation sharpens the mind or slowly unravels it. Out here, you can feel both happening at once. Your awareness is sharper, details stand out, patterns connect, but your thoughts also linger longer, looping back on themselves in ways they didn't before. Silence has a way of stretching everything. At one point, you stop in a small clearing, turning slowly in place. You're testing yourself. No obvious landmarks, just trees, snow, sky. And yet, you know which way is back. Not perfectly, not confidently, but enough. You take a step in that direction, then another, letting instinct guide you. It's not blind anymore. It's built on everything you've been quietly collecting. The angle of the light, the slope under your feet, the way the wind brushes past your left side instead of your right. It works. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, the familiar shapes return. The bent log, the split spruce. You shelter, half hidden, but unmistakably yours.
You let out a breath you didn't realize you were holding. That feeling, that quiet confirmation that you can leave and come back, is bigger than any single meal, bigger than warmth even, because it means you're not just surviving moment to moment anymore. You're starting to exist here. You step inside, brushing snow from your shoulders, the space greeting you with that same faint scent of wood and cold air. It's still rough, still imperfect, but now it feels anchored, yours in a deeper way. You sit down, pulling your pack closer, and for a moment, you just listen. The forest outside continues its quiet, indifferent rhythm. Nothing has changed out there, but something has changed in you. You're not lost anymore, not completely. And in a place like this, that might be the difference between fading away and lasting long enough to become part of the silence itself.
You don't notice the animal at first, which in this place is usually how it works. You're moving along one of your now familiar paths, the one marked by that slightly crooked spruce and the shallow dip where snow always gathers deeper. Your steps are quieter than before, not silent, but improved, controlled. You're learning, slowly trading clumsiness for awareness. Then something feels off. Not a sound, not movement, just a shift, like the forest has tilted half a degree in a direction you can't quite name. You stop, mid-step, breath hanging faintly in front of you, and let your eyes move instead of your feet. There, a shape between the trees. Your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. Every muscle tightens, your breathing slows without you asking it to, and your awareness narrows into a single sharp line connecting you to that animal. A wolf. Not massive, not monstrous, just real, solid, quietly powerful in a way that doesn't need to announce itself. Here's your historical anchor. Wolves have long been a part of Alaska's ecosystem, and despite their reputation, documented attacks on humans are extremely rare. Most encounters end exactly like this: two beings noticing each other and deciding what to do next. Still, knowing that doesn't exactly make your heartbeat slow down. You stay still, completely, because suddenly every movement feels like a decision you can't undo. The wolf tilts its head slightly, studying you. There's no immediate aggression, no dramatic tension like in a movie, just curiosity, assessment. You're both doing the same thing, really, trying to understand what stands in front of you. Historians still argue whether early lone settlers feared wolves more because of real danger or because of inherited stories that exaggerated their threat. Standing here now, you realize it's not fear exactly. It's respect, edged with uncertainty. You shift your weight, slowly, deliberately, not backing away, not advancing, just existing, showing you're not prey, but also not a threat worth testing. The wolf watches. Then, after a long, stretched moment, it looks away first. that small action carries more meaning than you expected. It steps back, quiet as breath, then turns and moves between the trees, dissolving into the forest like it was never there. No dramatic exit, no sound, just gone. You remain still for a few seconds longer, just in case your body needs time to catch up with reality again. Then you exhale, a slow release of tension you didn't realize had built up that much. Well, that just happened. A quirky detail drifts into your thoughts. Wolves often avoid direct confrontation not because they're timid, but because energy conservation is critical in harsh environments. Every risk has a cost. Out here, unnecessary conflict is just bad math. You nod slightly to yourself, as if the forest just explained something and you're politely acknowledging it. Lesson learned.
The darkness doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in. That's the unsettling part. You don't notice the exact moment daylight gives up. It just thins. The shadows stretch a little longer each day, the sky a little duller, until one evening you realize you've been working in half-light for hours without questioning it. Winter in Alaska doesn't fall. It settles. Slowly. Permanently. You stand outside your shelter, watching the horizon blur into a muted band of gray. The forest feels different again. Not louder, not quieter, just deeper, like everything has been pulled inward. Even the wind seems more thoughtful. A mainstream historical fact crosses your mind as you adjust your coat. In northern Alaska, especially above the Arctic Circle, winter brings prolonged periods of near or total darkness known as polar night. While you're not fully that far north, the psychological effects still creep in. Less light means less structure to time, and without time, days start to lose edges. You notice it already. Morning doesn't feel like morning anymore. It's just less dark. Evening is more dark. Everything in between is a guess. Here's a quirky detail. Early explorers in polar regions sometimes carried sand timers or divided their routines into artificial schedules just to maintain sanity. Not because it was efficient, but because the mind craves structure, even when nature refuses to provide it. You try something similar. Not a timer, but habits. You assign meaning to actions. Morning is fire. Midday is movement. Evening is preparation. Night is stillness. It's arbitrary, but it works better than drifting. Mostly. Historians still argue whether isolation-induced time distortion is purely psychological or partially physiological due to lack of environmental cues. Out here, you don't care which side is right. You just know your sense of when has started slipping. One day, you realize you've been awake longer than you intended without feeling tired in the usual way. Another time, you sleep and wake, unsure how long you've been out. The forest doesn't correct you. It doesn't care. That's the real shift. Not cold, not hunger, not even danger. Time stops behaving normally. You begin to rely more on rituals. Lighting fire becomes your anchor. You do it with increasing precision now, selecting kindling, arranging it to catch wind efficiently, protecting it from drifting snow. Fire isn't just warmth anymore. It's confirmation, proof that something is still under your control. And fire becomes your companion in the long dark. One evening, you sit near it longer than usual. The flames move in steady, hypnotic patterns, casting shifting shadows across the inside of your shelter. Outside, everything is black. Not dramatic black, just absence. A kind of endless, unbroken tone. You listen to it, or maybe you imagine you do. A strange thought crosses your mind. Ancient cultures often associated fire with consciousness itself.
the thing that separates living awareness from the void. Sitting here now, you understand why. Without it, the world would feel less like a place and more like a concept you're trapped inside. You add another small piece of wood. The flame responds immediately, growing slightly brighter, like it's acknowledging you. Small comforts matter more now. Spruce tea returns, not as discovery, but as routine. Shelter repairs become daily maintenance. Even the sound of snow shifting outside starts to feel familiar instead of threatening. But the darkness...
Sometimes you think you hear things. Not sounds exactly, patterns. Movement where there isn't any. The mind filling in gaps the eyes can't confirm. You learn not to trust every interpretation. Not immediately, anyway. You step outside once during what you estimate is mid-cycle, though you can't be sure. The sky is a dim gray wash, neither day nor night. The snow reflects it weakly, giving everything a flattened, dreamlike quality. For a moment, you just stand there. No urgency, no task, just awareness. The forest is still alive around you. That much is clear. It breathes in its own way, shaped by wind, by movement, by things you rarely see but constantly feel. And you realize something quietly, without drama or revelation. You are adapting. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but steadily. The darkness doesn't feel like an ending anymore. It feels like another condition to learn. You turn back toward your shelter, the fire waiting inside like a small refusal against the vast silence. And you step in.
Fire stops being something you make and starts becoming something you maintain. That's the shift you didn't notice at first. Early on, fire was effort, striking sparks, coaxing flame, celebrating every success like a small miracle. Now, it's discipline, routine, a responsibility that sits somewhere between breathing and staying alive. You wake before you're fully aware of waking. The first thought is always the same. Is it still there? The glow answers before anything else can. A faint orange pulse inside your shelter. Low but steady. Not dying, not growing. Just existing, like it's waiting for you to participate again. You sit up, stiff, and immediately reach for the wood you've already prepared. That's another change. You no longer search for materials in the moment. Everything is staged, anticipated. Firewood, kindling, backups. Survival, it turns out, is mostly logistics disguised as struggle. A mainstream historical fact slides into place as you tend the embers. Many Arctic survival accounts emphasize fire as the central organizing element of daily life, especially in winter camps. Not just for warmth, but for drying gear, cooking, and maintaining psychological stability. Everything orbits it.
You add a small piece of spruce. The flame responds with quiet approval, growing slightly brighter, like it recognizes your consistency. Here's a quirky detail. Certain types of resinous wood, like spruce, can burn even when slightly damp due to their natural oils. Early trappers sometimes referred to it as life wood because it could save a fire in conditions where other fuel would fail. You don't know the term when you first learn it, but you understand the concept immediately. You've learned to trust that kind of reliability. Outside, the world is still submerged in muted light. Not quite night, not quite day, just continuation. The kind of sky that makes everything feel paused, as if the entire landscape is waiting for a cue that never comes. You step out briefly, fire crackling behind you. The cold hits immediately, sharp, precise, unchanged. It never becomes familiar, not fully. You just become better at ignoring its objections. You scan the area around your shelter. Snow has drifted higher in places, softening edges, reshaping your small territory. You check your subtle markers, the angled branch, the bark notch, still there. still yours. The forest hasn't erased them yet. That small continuity feels important in a way you can't quite articulate. You return inside, closing off the wind again. The fire is stronger now, fed properly, steady. You sit near it longer than necessary, not because you're cold, but because it organizes your thoughts. And then you realize something. You're no longer reacting to survival. You're managing it. That doesn't mean it's easy. It means it's structured. You begin refining everything. Fire placement, fuel ratios, even how you enter and exit the shelter. Always minimizing heat loss, always anticipating wind direction. These aren't dramatic skills. They're quiet adjustments, but they add up. One evening, you experiment slightly, placing stones in a loose ring around the fire to reflect heat inward. It works better than expected. Not revolutionary, just improved efficiency. Still, you feel a small, private satisfaction. Progress in this place is rarely loud. Here's a quieter truth you start noticing. Your thoughts are changing shape. Less scattered, more linear. Problems present themselves, and instead of spiraling outward, you trace them inward, step by step, like following tracks in snow. You catch yourself thinking ahead more often. Not far ahead, just enough to prepare. That alone feels like a victory. Outside, something moves in the distance, just a shift of shadow between trees. You don't react immediately anymore. You observe for.
By now, nothing you own stays simple for long. Even tools, even habits, even thoughts. You start noticing that everything in your world has become improvised engineering. A problem appears, and instead of waiting for something better, you reshape what you already have. That's the real skill you're developing here. Not strength, not endurance, but improvisation under pressure that never fully stops. Your knife is no longer just a knife. It's a carved handle reinforced with wrapped sinew and softened edges from repeated sharpening on riverstone. Your cooking pot has a dent that you've learned to rotate away from direct heat. Even your shelter has evolved, patched, reinforced, adjusted, like a living structure instead of a fixed one. A mainstream historical fact anchors this change. Arctic and subarctic survival cultures often relied on multi-purpose tools, where a single item could serve dozens of functions depending on need. Efficiency wasn't a choice, it was survival logic. Carry less, adapt more. You look at your current setup and realize you've started thinking the same way without being taught. Here's a quirky detail. In extreme survival environments, even small objects, like bone fragments, stone shards, or hardened wood, can become essential components of larger systems. Nothing stays just trash for long. Everything has potential if you're patient enough to see it differently.
You sit outside your shelter one afternoon, working on something small, a piece of driftwood you've been slowly shaping. It's not a spear, not yet, not exactly. More like a possibility. You adjust its balance, test the weight, rework the tip. It's imperfect, but it holds intention. You pause and glance at your surroundings. The forest is unchanged at a glance, but your perception of it is different now. You see resources instead of obstacles, structural possibilities instead of empty space. Historians still argue whether long-term isolation encourages creativity or simply forces necessity to masquerade as innovation. Sitting here, carving wood with frozen fingers, you suspect the answer is uncomfortably simple. It's both, depending on the day. A distant movement catches your eye. Small, quick, gone before it fully registers. You don't chase it. You don't even stand immediately. Instead, you just observe. That restraint is new. Earlier versions of you would have reacted. This version evaluates. That change matters more than any single tool you've made. You return to your work. The driftwood takes shape slowly, becoming more intentional with each pass. You're not rushing.
Rushing wastes precision, and precision out here is a form of control. Later, inside your shelter, you test another idea. You've started organizing space in ways that feel almost architectural. Fire placement matters more now. You experiment with airflow, noticing how smoke behaves depending on angles and gaps. You adjust, observe, adjust again. It's not dramatic, it's iterative. That's the pattern of everything now.
Here's a small but important discovery. When you reduce unnecessary movement, you conserve more than energy. You conserve attention. And attention, in isolation, is a limited resource. You can feel it now, how the mind prefers simplicity when everything else is already complex. Outside, the wind shifts direction again. You notice it before it reaches your shelter fully, which feels like a quiet win. You adjust a covering slightly to compensate. No celebration, just correction. You begin thinking of yourself less as someone enduring a place and more as someone negotiating with it. That shift is subtle, but significant. The land doesn't soften. You just learn where it bends. One evening, you sit and examine your tools together. Each one carries signs of use, adaptation, repair. Nothing remains pristine. And strangely, that feels right. Historians still argue whether survival environments strip humanity down or refine it into something more efficient but less recognizable. You don't have an answer, but you notice that your sense of waste has...
Illness doesn't knock. It just rearranges you from the inside and waits to see what you'll do about it. It starts small, so small you almost miss it. A heaviness in your limbs that doesn't match the work you did the day before. A dull pressure behind your eyes. You tell yourself it's fatigue, nothing more. You've earned fatigue. That feels reasonable. But then the cold feels sharper than usual. Not outside, inside. Like your body can't quite remember how to regulate itself anymore. You sit up slower that morning. The fire is still there, but it doesn't feel as cooperative. The warmth doesn't reach as far into you as it used to. You add wood, adjust position, wait for the familiar response. It comes, but faintly, like it's arriving from further away than before. A mainstream historical fact surfaces in the back of her mind. In isolated Arctic and frontier conditions, minor infections or fevers could become serious not because of their severity alone, but because of the absence of immediate medical care and the body's reduced resilience under constant stress. Small problems didn't stay small for long. You breathe out slowly. It fogs in front of you, thicker than usual. That's when you accept it. You're not just tired.
Something is off. Here's a quirky detail that suddenly feels less quirky and more important. In extreme cold environments, dehydration can happen even when surrounded by snow and ice, because dry air and exertion silently drain the body's fluids. You realize you haven't been drinking enough water, proper water, not just spruce tea or melted snow in passing. You force yourself to act. That's the difference now. Not knowledge, but response. You melt snow, carefully, watching the process with slower patience than usual. Even that feels like effort. When it's ready, you drink more deliberately this time. Not for comfort, for correction. Historians still argue whether early survival failures in extreme climates were more often caused by external conditions or by delayed recognition of internal decline. Sitting here, you understand how easy it is to ignore yourself when everything outside demands attention first. You rest for a while after drinking, letting your body settle. The forest outside doesn't change its behavior to accommodate you. It never does. Wind continues its slow movement through the trees. Snow shifts in soft increments. The world remains indifferent. And yet, you notice something new. Your awareness has sharpened in a different direction.
not outward, but inward. You're listening to yourself more carefully than before, tracking small changes, temperature, energy.
You lie back briefly, eyes half open, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood. Your thoughts drift, but not far. They stay anchored more than they used to. Even that is progress of a different kind. By evening, you're functional again. Not fully restored, but stabilized. The fire is steady, your water is prepared, your shelter holds. You take inventory without urgency. That's important. You're not panicking, you're assessing. Outside, the darkness thickens again, as it always does, folding the world into deeper quiet. But this time, it feels less threatening and more like a background condition you've learned to work within. Historians still argue whether long-term survival in isolation depends more on physical resilience or on the ability to interpret subtle internal signals before they escalate. You're beginning to suspect it's neither exclusively. It's the relationship between the two. Your body speaks. You're learning to listen earlier. You close your eyes for a moment near the fire, not sleeping fully, just resting in presence. The warmth reaches you better now, or maybe you've just adjusted again. Either way, you're still here, still adapting, still moving forward, even when the movement is barely visible from the outside. And in this place, that kind of recovery is its own form of survival.
The first hint that something is changing doesn't come from the weather. It comes from the smell. You notice it one morning when you step outside your shelter. The air still carries cold, still carries that familiar sharpness. But underneath it, something different, less static, more alive. You pause, inhaling slowly, trying to place it. Then you realize it's earth. Not frozen permanence, but thawing possibility. Spring, or something close to it, is beginning its slow return. A mainstream historical fact anchors the moment. In Alaska and other subarctic regions, seasonal transitions can be abrupt after long periods of cold, with snowmelt dramatically altering terrain in a matter of weeks. What was once rigid becomes fluid almost overnight. Rivers swell, paths vanish, and the landscape rewrites itself again. You look around and see it happening already. Snow edges are softening, icicles drip with hesitant patience. The forest floor, long buried, begins to show dark patches of soil, like the land is remembering its own skin. Here's a quirky detail. During spring thaw in northern environments, some animals time their migration or activity so precisely that they arrive within days of temperature shifts, as if they're reading signals you can't perceive. The ecosystem doesn't guess, it tracks. You start tracking too. Your daily movement expands again. Paths that were once nearly impossible are now passable, though unstable. Snow no longer supports weight consistently, forcing you to test each step like a negotiation. 1 foot forward, check, adjust, continue. Historians still argue whether seasonal change in extreme climates is more disruptive or more liberating to early survival patterns. Out here, you feel both at once. Movement becomes easier, but unpredictability increases. You discover this the hard way when a shallow-looking patch suddenly gives way, plunging your leg into hidden meltwater beneath snow. The shock is immediate. Not dangerous, but startling enough to remind you that the land is in transition, not stability. You pull yourself out, cold seeping quickly into fabric, and continue without complaint. Adaptation has changed your response to setbacks. Less reaction, more correction. Inside your shelter, you begin adjusting again. Ventilation matters more now. Moisture management becomes a daily concern. Fire still anchors everything, but now it fights a different enemy. Not cold alone, but dampness creeping in from all sides. You expand your range further into the forest, and for the first time in a long while, food becomes slightly more available. Not abundant, but present in new ways. Early shoots,
small signs of returning life. You don't rush it. You observe first.
A small, almost forgotten thought surfaces. Seasons aren't just environmental. They are biological triggers. Entire systems waking at once after long dormancy. You feel it in yourself, too, subtly. Energy returning in uneven waves, thoughts less heavy, sleep slightly more natural. Not recovery in a clean sense, but renewal in fragments. Here's a quieter realization. The forest doesn't reset, it transitions. And you are learning to transition with it instead of resisting. You begin repairing and expanding your shelter again, not because winter is gone, but because it's loosening its grip. You take advantage of every dry hour, reinforcing weak points, adjusting structure for upcoming instability. At one point, you stop and look at your surroundings. The difference is undeniable now. The land is no longer a locked system of ice and silence. It is opening, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Historians still argue whether survival in seasonal extremes is more about enduring harsh periods or exploiting brief windows of opportunity. Standing here now, you understand the answer.
Memory starts behaving strangely when silence is your longest companion. You notice it on a morning that doesn't feel different at first. Same cold air, same muted light, same soft creak of trees adjusting to their own weight. But as you sit near your fire, watching it settle into its familiar rhythm, something odd happens. You lose track of why you were thinking about what you were thinking about. Not a blank moment, more like a drift. A thought begins and doesn't finish where it used to. You shake it off, assuming fatigue, but it keeps happening in small ways. Names slip away quicker. Sequences blur at the edges. Even the order of your routines starts requiring more effort to hold in place. A mainstream historical fact anchors this experience. Long-term isolation, especially in extreme environments, has been documented to affect memory consolidation and recall, partly due to lack of external conversational reinforcement and repetitive cognitive grounding. Without dialogue, thoughts echo instead of locking in place. You sit with that realization longer than you mean to. The fire pops softly in front of you, indifferent.
Here's a quirky detail. Some Arctic researchers have noted that isolated individuals often begin talking to structure, not people, but objects and routines, as a way to stabilize thought patterns. You catch yourself doing it once, speaking softly to the act of rebuilding your fire ring, as if narrating helps hold it steady in your mind. You stop yourself. Then, a moment later, realize it helped. Historians still argue whether cognitive drift in isolation is a decline in mental function or an adaptation toward internal self-dialogue systems. You're not sure you care which label is correct. You just know you need anchors. So you build them. You begin structuring your days more strictly again. Not like winter survival, but like mental maintenance. Tasks are ordered, repeated, reinforced. Fire first. Water next. Movement. Observation. Rest. You repeat it not because you forgot it, but because repetition itself becomes protection. Still, the mind wanders. Sometimes you find yourself standing somewhere in the forest and realizing you don't remember walking there fully. Not lost, but slightly displaced from your own timeline. You retrace your steps more carefully now, not just physically, but mentally. What did I do before this? What comes after? You rely more on physical markers again. The split spruce, the angled branch.
You begin recalling things that don't feel immediate. Not new memories, but older ones. Pre-Alaska fragments. Faces, places, conversations that arrive without warning, then fade just as quickly. Not emotional, just floating. Like the mind is testing stored material for integrity. A strange realization settles in. Isolation doesn't erase memory.
It rearranges access to it. One afternoon, you sit by your shelter entrance and simply watch the forest. It's changed again. Greener now, more open. Movement is easier, but attention feels more divided. Too many inputs returning at once after months of simplicity. A distant sound catches your attention. Water moving, louder than before. Melt has progressed. The land is no longer silent white. It is layered again with sound, texture, variation. You notice you're having to filter more deliberately. Choose what to focus on. That becomes another skill: cognitive selection. Here's a quieter truth. You are not just surviving environment anymore. You are managing perception. What you allow into focus determines how stable your internal world feels. You sit and breathe, letting the fire anchor you again. It doesn't just warm your body anymore. It organizes your attention. Outside, the forest continues its seasonal transformation, indifferent to your internal adjustments. But you are not static either. You compensate, you structure, you adapt again. This time not physically, but mentally.
Time doesn't announce itself anymore. It just accumulates, quietly, indifferently. You realize this one morning while staring at your fire, now so familiar it almost feels like another organ, something you maintain without thinking, something that keeps you functioning in ways you can't fully separate from yourself anymore. 30 years is a strange idea when you try to hold it in your mind out here. It doesn't feel like a number. It feels like layers. Winters stacked on winters. Springs folding into springs. Each one slightly different, but all blending into the same slow motion of survival. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scale of it. Long-term solitary survival cases in extreme environments are rare, but documented instances show that human cognition can adapt to prolonged isolation, though not without significant psychological restructuring. The brain doesn't stay the same. It reorganizes. You sit back slightly, listening to the wind move through trees that you now know too well, not by name, but by behavior. You recognize how they bend under pressure, how they creak before storms, how they settle after. Here's a quirky detail. Some researchers studying long-term isolation have noted that individuals often develop highly refined environmental prediction skills, able to sense weather shifts or animal presence through micro-cues most people never consciously register. You've stopped noticing when that ability developed. It's just there now.
Historians still argue whether prolonged isolation produces wisdom or simply removes alternative perspectives, leaving only a single, deeply reinforced worldview. Sitting here, you realize it doesn't feel like either. It feels like narrowing. Not loss, but focus. You move through your routine with quiet efficiency. Fire, water, inspection, repair, observation. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Every action has been repeated so many times it no longer feels like decision-making. It feels like continuity. And yet, inside that repetition, there are fractures of thought. Moments where you pause longer than necessary. Not confusion, not distress, just reflection that has nowhere else to go. You catch yourself sometimes speaking aloud, not for communication, but for structure, narrating your actions like they need witness, even when none exists. It doesn't feel strange anymore. It feels stabilizing. The forest around you is no longer unknown. It is cataloged in memory, even if imperfectly. You know where water gathers after melt, where wind accelerates between ridges, where animals pass through without hesitation. You are not exploring anymore. You are inhabiting. One afternoon, you stand at the edge of a clearing and realize something unsettlingly simple. You could probably walk for hours in.
Here's a quieter truth you've come to understand without ever being told. Survival is less about endurance and more about continuity. The ability to keep systems running long after motivation stops being relevant. You check your shelter. Still stable. Modified over the years, but always functional. Nothing original remains. And yet, it still feels like home. Not because of sentiment, but because of familiarity encoded through repetition. Historians still argue whether long-term isolation eventually leads to detachment from identity or the creation of a more distilled, essential self. You don't feel detached. You feel reduced to what continues working. And that, strangely, is enough. You sit near the fire again, watching it the way you always do now. Not as fascination, but as calibration. It tells you things without words. Fuel level, airflow, stability. Outside, the forest continues its cycles. Seasons no longer feel dramatic. They feel procedural, predictable variations on a long-established pattern. You breathe in slowly, out slowly. There is no urgency anymore, no countdown, no arrival point. Just continuation. And somewhere in that endless continuity, you realize you are no longer waiting for anything. Not rescue, not change, not even meaning. You are simply here. Still. Present. Ongoing.
Silence, after decades, stops feeling like absence. It becomes texture, something you can almost lean against. You notice it first thing in what might be morning, though that word has long since lost its sharp edges. The light outside your shelter is softer now, filtered through trees you've known in every season, every variation of snow, thaw, and return. Nothing surprises you anymore in the way it used to. And that's exactly what makes you pause. Not because something is wrong, because something is finally complete. A mainstream historical fact settles quietly into the background of your thoughts. In long-term isolation cases, individuals often report that external change becomes less emotionally significant over time, while internal continuity becomes the primary measure of existence. The world stops being an event. It becomes a condition. You step outside slowly. The ground responds the way it always does, familiar underfoot, predictable in its imperfections. Trees stand in their usual positions, shaped by decades of wind and weight. The forest is no longer something you interpret. It is something you read instantly, like a language you no longer translate. You simply understand.
Here's a quirky detail. Some researchers studying extreme isolation have noted that people sometimes begin to perceive patterns of presence in environments that remain unchanged for long periods. Not hallucinations, but cognitive mapping of familiarity so deep it feels like companionship. You don't question whether that applies to you. You just notice the forest feels less empty than it logically should. Historians still argue whether extended solitude ultimately reshapes a person into something unrecognizable or reveals a more fundamental version of them that was always there. Standing here now, you suspect the answer stopped mattering a long time ago. You walk a short distance from your shelter, not because you need to, but because movement is still part of the structure you maintain. Your steps are steady, economical. Nothing is wasted anymore. Not energy, not attention, not thought. You pass the split spruce, the angled branch, the older notches in bark that have softened with time but never disappeared entirely. They are no longer markers for orientation. They are simply part of the landscape's memory, and yours. You stop at a familiar clearing. Snow, or what remains of it in this season, rests unevenly across the ground. Somewhere nearby, water moves beneath the surface. Quiet, continuous, hidden, but certain. You listen.
Not for anything specific, just because listening has become part of how you exist here. And in that listening, there is nothing urgent, nothing demanding, just the layered presence of a place you have outlasted long enough to stop being separate from.